Thank you so much, Nicole, for being here. Um, I just wanted to acknowledge, echoing Michael, that this is a time of uprising and outrage and exhaustion. And if you are here and you're feeling that anger and you're feeling that sorrow, I hope that this 45-minute session of talking about fiction brings you some rest and some energy. So I'll just read for a couple minutes, not long at all. So I'm reading from A Burning, which comes out today, and I'll read just the beginning. "You smell like smoke," my mother said to me. So I rubbed an oval of soap in my hair and poured a whole bucket of water on myself before a neighbor complained that I was wasting the morning supply. There was a curfew that day. On the main street, a police jeep would creep by every half hour. Daily wage laborers compelled to work would come home with arms raised to show they had no weapons. In bed, my wet hair spread on the pillow, I picked up my new phone, purchased with my own salary, screen guard still attached, and on Facebook there was only one conversation: these terrorists attacked the wrong neighborhood. The more I scrolled, the more Facebook unrolled. The night before, I had been at the railway station, no more than a 15-minute walk from my house. I ought to have seen the men who stole up to the open window, but all I saw were carriages burning, their doors locked from the outside and dangerously hot. The fire spread to huts bordering the station, smoke filling the chests of those who lived there. More than 100 people died. The government promised compensation to the families of the dead, 80,000 rupees, which, well, the government promises many things. In a video, to the dozen microphones thrust at his chin, the chief minister was saying, "Let the authorities investigate." Somebody had spliced this comment with a video of policemen scratching their heads. It made me laugh. I admired these strangers on Facebook who said anything they wanted to. They were not afraid of making jokes. Whether it was about the police or the ministers, they had their fun. In a video clip further down the page, a woman came forward, her hair flying, her nose running, her eyes red. She was standing on the sloping platform of our railway station, and into the microphone she screamed, "There was a jeep full of policemen right there. Ask them why they stood around and watched while my husband burned. He tried to open the door and save my daughter. He tried and tried." I shared that video. I added a caption. "Policemen paid by the government watched and did nothing, while this innocent woman lost everything," I wrote. I laid the phone next to my head and dozed. The heat brought sleep to my eyes. When I checked my phone next, there were only 2 likes. A half hour later, still 2 likes. Under my thumb, I watched post after post about the train attack earn 50 likes, 100 likes, 300 likes. Nobody liked my reply. And then in the small glowing screen, I wrote a foolish thing. I wrote a dangerous thing, a thing nobody like me should ever think, let alone write. Forgive me, Ma. If the police didn't help ordinary people like you and me, if the police watched them die, doesn't that mean, I wrote on Facebook, that the government is also a terrorist? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Megha. It was really thrilling to hear you read. I realize that's the first time I've gotten to hear you read. This is such a beautiful, brave, wonderful book. And I know this is a strange moment to have a book out for a lot of reasons, but I just want to say how much it means to me to get to be here to celebrate your book tonight. I had a really hard time deciding what to ask you first because there are so many things I'd love to get into that would unfortunately like veer into spoiler territory. And this is just a beautifully constructed novel that I think everyone should have the pleasure of reading for the first time, surprises, twists, and all. Um, you're obviously writing about India, where you grew up, and not the US. And as we've talked about, I'm really loath to try to draw inexact parallels, but I think there are definitely elements of this novel that will be so familiar to any American reader, especially right now. Your book sheds light on individuals and communities facing injustice and persecution, untrustworthy institutions, and ambitious politicians trying to take advantage of the moment, the rise of right-wing nationalist sentiment and violence, and just how hard so many people, like two of your three main characters, have to work just to live and seek safety and dignity and stability for their families, and how much time and energy that takes up. I was really struck by that in the book. Just how it robs them of chances to do other things and delay some of their dreams. We see these multiply marginalized people trying to build community and live as they choose. I know some authors probably start at the beginning and some start at the middle or the end, and ever since I read this book, again, it's just so beautifully constructed. I wondered what was kind of the initial spark or seed of an idea that made you want to feel that you had to write this book. And as we see people rising up all over the country to protest state violence and police brutality, does this change in any way for you? Do you think how readers might encounter your story?
You know, it's so strange to have the book launch in this moment because I started writing it in a similar mood, but that was years ago. Just paying attention and trying to recognize how governments bring systems of oppression, the whole might of the state and its institutions of oppression are brought to bear on certain marginalized people. And in India, that's communities like Muslims, and in the US, it's communities of Black people. And just as a tiny tangent, you know, when you were talking about parallels, there are actually really strong links between white supremacy and Hindu nationalism, which, you know, there are journalists and scholars writing about this, so I won't go into. Coming from that place of hate-filled, xenophobic, blind nationalism. And I saw India turning in that direction, and I felt fearful and I felt angry. And I wanted to look at how ordinary individuals survive this turn. You know, how do people chase big dreams? How do people chase a life that means something to them while they are living under all of these oppressive forces?
I was so struck by that in your book. Just you're writing so movingly about the complexity and the intense vulnerability of being a person, like a citizen, who should be able to count on things like safety and basic dignity and cannot. But they still, as you say, they're trying to make a life, make their own choices, follow their dreams to the extent that they can. Your story is told through characters just like this. It's in this fast-paced, overlapping way, alternating between like three main characters' perspectives, as Michael mentioned, with occasional one-shots that I actually really loved, featuring people we don't spend as much time with. But the narrative shifts provide like a lot of the tension in your story, right? Like what keeps you turning pages is partly like who will take over next and how will their perspective drive the action. Can you talk a little bit about, like, in more detail about the structure and pacing of this book, how you found that, especially given these characters? And was the general timeline and sequence of events something you always kind of had a firm grasp on, or did you try a few different things to figure it out?
I am so glad that you found the pace satisfying, Nicole, because that was something that I worked so hard on. Something that I really wanted to accomplish with this book is I knew I wanted to say something intellectually serious about the rise of right-wing nationalism, but at the same time, I knew that I wanted to write a really entertaining, inviting book. And so much of that was, for me, getting the pace right. And I think I found inspiration in TV shows. It was, how at that time people would come and watch Netflix, and people would talk about binge watching shows. And I just thought that there were so many interesting craft lessons in that. How do you keep someone coming back to your story from episode to episode? How do you make someone so invested in a character that they feel they must know what happens to this character? And so I try to learn lessons from TV for the structure. And the interludes, I'm so glad that you liked them. So this book has, like Nicole said, but there are these short chapters where we kind of open doors and see a little bit of other people's lives. And that came out of this recognition that, there are so many such lives, rich, contradictory, complex lives that you could follow in this book. And I felt that I could only do justice to 3. But I wanted to kind of leave these little other doors ajar.
I'm so curious about like which television shows in particular, but I will note that I never would have thought of that till you just said it, but it's true. We'd be getting to the end of one of your chapters and something big is about to happen to someone, and that's when we cut away to somebody else, which I wouldn't have thought at all to compare it to television, but that makes total sense. That your characters' voices are each like just such an individual achievement really in writing because they're so vivid. The story is made real for us through them. Like when they speak, we're right there with them, whoever they are, even sometimes if they're not like our favorite character or we can't really understand their perspective. They're all like ambitious in these different ways, and you see what happens to them as they try to move up in this like shaky world, and it brings into stark relief all these larger like political issues and traumas. So at the center of your story, you have these 2 young women, Jeevan and Lovely, who are marginalized in different ways. They're both poor. Jeevan is Muslim and has been uprooted from her former home. And Lovely is Hijra, which is a name given to trans and intersex people in India, with dreams of being an actress. And then you have Jeevan's former gym teacher, PT Sir, who like has a more comfortable life, but just feels he deserves more. Can you talk about these 3 characters in particular, how they like became your 3 mains? Because reading the book, especially the interludes, I sometimes wondered if your scope was originally much wider and then it narrowed to these 3. And what was it about these 3? How did you decide the story was theirs?
I landed upon these 3 because I felt like they were the best characters for exploring particular questions that I had in mind. So with Jeevan's character, I really wanted to see how somebody who works really hard and really earnestly, I think we've long dismantled the myth that, we live in a meritocracy and that you can get ahead on hard work alone. But I really wanted to look at that, like how somebody who works so hard can still find herself challenged and oppressed and defeated by the state's systems. It's lovely. She's marginalized in all of these complex ways, but she holds this wild, impossible dream, which is to become a movie star. And so I really wanted to write this kind of joyous, bold, defiant arc of somebody who dares to go from the very margins of society to the very center of its public life. And then with PT Sir, he is someone who is a school teacher, and sorry, there's a very noisy motorcycle outside. I don't know if you can hear that.
I'm just relieved it's like not one of my children that we're hearing, so it's fine. It's fine.
So with PT Sir, he's a school teacher who gets a tiny glimpse of power as he grows closer to this right-wing political party. And I wanted to see how somebody like that reacts to that bit of power. What do you do when you suddenly realize that you have access to this power in a society with huge power differentials? What will you give up? What ethics will you hold on to?
That makes a lot of sense. About the interludes, I really loved, especially the ones about Jeevan's parents. I was just really moved by that. Were they ever like meant to be like larger characters? Because we mostly get their story through their daughters.
You know, something that I find very moving is this moment where you as a child realize that you have become your parents' guardian, and you feel that sense of care and responsibility toward them. And I find that flip so full of pathos and so incredibly moving. And so I felt that those were the sections where I really wanted to bring them in and really show the kind of relationship that Jeevan has with them.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to switch gears here just a minute to talk a little bit more about just like your process and your routine. So like on Twitter, you shared this photo holding a finished copy of your book, and you mentioned, I mean, something I thought was incredible was that you never talked about this book while you were working on it. I knew that was true because we worked together. Like I had no idea until you sold it. And you said on Twitter it was your way of guarding its energy and writing like the most ambitious book you could. I was intrigued by that for many reasons, partly because many writers I know never shut up about writing. So when you say you did not talk about it with anyone first, is that true? Like you must have had like readers. Along the way, or was it really just like top secret?
It wasn't top secret. I had for a long time a really close friend of mine, Laura Preston, who is also a brilliant writer. She and I have been doing these 2-person workshops, and she saw a lot of early material and gave really sharp critique on a lot of early material. But and my husband read early drafts too and really helped shape the book. But I think what I meant by that was that I didn't want to bring the book into a space of casual conversation. I never spoke about it, you know, at parties. I never mentioned to anyone else that I was working on it. And part of that was because I really think that each book, while you are working on it, has such immense energy. And the work of the book is so much trying to figure out how you can best say what you want to say in the book, right? So I didn't want to have all of these other channels of communication open around the book. I wanted all communication to be focused on the book. Like I would say nothing about the book would say what it had to say, you know?
That is amazing. Can you, so that really helped you kind of guard the book and stick to your intentions, like regarding it. How long did you work on it?
About 4 years.
Okay, that's like from drafting to submission, or does that include edits?
That's starting work until I think submitting it to agents, I think. I haven't kept very strict track of it, but
what even is time? So it's okay. So I always really like to hear about like an author's process, and I'm hoping you'll talk a bit more about that. And also about your writing routine. And I admit that a little of this is selfish too, because I have seen you work. I know how laser-like your focus is. And I also know that you're one of the busiest and hardest working people ever, and you still found time to write this novel. So like when and how, and what was that even like? And then what is it like to work on a novel while you are also working in publishing and editing words like writers every single day?
Nicole, I feel like I could ask you the same thing.
Yes, but this is your book.
Well, I think for me, a lot of it was just taking the little amounts of time, 20 minutes in the morning before work, and that's what you take. I found often that contact with the work, even on days when I couldn't really work on it, was very important. It allowed the book to be animate and kind of alive in the space of imagination in my mind. And that was so important. So just a read of the pages that I had meant so much on days when I couldn't actively write anything. But yeah, I really think it's the slow accumulation of a few minutes in the morning. Sometimes you have an hour on a weekend. And just to continue, I think, you know, for a long time before I started working on this book, I don't think I was very serious about writing. And that's because I didn't have anything to say, you know? a tinkerer with writing. And then I realized once I had this book and I knew that I wanted to write this book, I knew that, I could make all of these excuses about, oh, I'm so busy, I can't do it, and live with the regret of not writing something that I know I can write, or I can write it, But I will also say that so much of this is, I'm an editor, as you know, but maybe some people watching don't. I'm an editor at Catapult. And Nicole, I've learned so much from working with you and having your guidance on edits on the magazine, and watching how devotedly and with care you work with your authors. And so I think part of it is so much working at a place like Catapult, where so many people, in addition to being editors and publicists and working in production and design and all of these different departments, are also writers and poets and artists. And I think that it's just an energizing workplace for me. So it never felt like the two were in conflict, really. I feel like I gained a lot from working at this really creative, trust-filled workplace.
Yes, it's a very inspiring place to work. I will say that. I'm curious too, and I always like to ask this of people who also, like, for part of their job, help other people, like hopefully help other people the way like you do. I've seen you are one of the most careful, sensitive, like wonderful editors I've seen work. And I guess I'm wondering, does that process of also working with your writers, formerly magazine and now mostly book authors, does that back and forth with writers also help you write in some sense? Which is not to say that's why you do the work, but
no,
because you make it look like an effortless kind of balance, but like I could see it like sometimes like interfering, and I could see it sometimes being really helpful.
It's definitely really inspiring. The authors that you take on, and this, you take them on because you become their biggest fan. You come from such a place of admiration for what they're doing. And so the chance to be so close to other people's work and to be so close to their sentences, structure, and to see them think on the page, I think that there is something invaluable in that, for sure. And also, just from the work of being an editor, you read so much, that I think for me, it definitely helped me sharpen the kind of movement and surprise and complexity that I wanted in my own book.
I think there are probably quite a few questions for you, and I do want to be sensitive to time. So this is my warning to everybody. If you haven't gotten your question in the chat, work on that. I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk and address readers' questions. But I did wonder, like, what kind of research was involved? And I know you have a background in anthropology, as Michael also mentioned. But in writing the story and these characters, you are obviously writing about places that you know and places you don't, and characters who maybe are from communities that you aren't personally a part of. So, like, what, if any, sources or research helped you when you were writing? I was thinking about this, especially with Lovely's Hijra community, but also, the world of politics or the made-up political party that you wrote about, and like the village, the home that Jivan and her family originally had. Like, if you haven't been to or lived in or among those spaces, like, was there research that was helpful?
Yeah, for sure. I love reading anthropology. I love reading ethnographies. So I read ethnographies of Hijra communities, like Gayatri Reddy does really beautiful work on this. Vaibhav Saria does really beautiful work on this. I watched a lot of journalism really fueled this in terms of me reading other people's journalism. So I read these local news articles. I remember an article from a long time ago about a slum demolition that I probably read about when I was, I don't know, very young in middle school, and that stayed with me and found its way into this book. So a lot of this comes from the news and what I have read growing up in India in the news. Some of it comes from I watched these Hindi and Bengali news channels where they did, short video clips going into places like the kitchen in a women's prison, which I would have no access to. And that kind of watching those videos helped me get a sense for the texture of that kind of place. So those were really helpful. But yeah, like you said, this book feels so personal to me. I grew up in India. My parents live there. I visit every year. And I was just writing about the and spirit that I knew so well.
It all comes across so vividly. So thank you for explaining kind of where a lot of that came from. I apologize. I said people should put questions in the chat. That is wrong. They should go in the Q&A feature. I see that now. Sorry. I have one more question, and then we can move to the Q&A part. But this is something I really wanted to ask you about, and something we talked a little bit about yesterday. Who are some authors you really love, and perhaps take some inspiration from right now? Particularly, I guess, in this moment.
Yeah. I have these books. I gathered them up and I put them by my side so I can show them. I highly, highly recommend Heads of the Colored People by Nafisa Thompson Spires. This is just a brilliant book of short stories that has stayed with me since I read it. And I read it right around when it came out, which was, I think, a couple years ago at this point. So that's one book that I highly recommend. Another that has been bringing me so much joy is Raven Lilani's Luster. This isn't out yet, but you can definitely pre-order it. I think it will be out in August. And this is such a hilarious and cutting and really sharp book. It's a really gorgeous book, highly recommend. And another book that I had in my stack here just to show is one that arrived a couple weeks ago, and I haven't read it yet, but it feels really important to boost this kind of book always, and especially right now. It's Anissa Ramirez's The Alchemy of Us. And this is a nonfiction book, and what intrigues me about this is I think it showcases inventors of color. So I'll pause there, but those are definitely some books that I'm excited about.
Thank you so much. I could keep going, but I want to make sure people have a chance to ask questions. Would it be helpful if I read the questions from the Q&A, or would someone from the bookstore like to?
I think usually the moderator takes care of it, but if you want, I can totally do it.
No, I would love to. And I already see a question that I was going to ask you anyway. But in part because you do spend so much time working with writers, what's the best advice you can give to an aspiring fiction writer?
Ooh, great question. I would say zoom in on the thing that only you can say, home in on the question that only you can ask, and then ask it as powerfully as you can. I think it is so important that a book have something to ask, a question to pose. And I think so many of us already know what that is. We're just kind of figuring out how to get there. Yeah, so I would definitely look for that question. And perhaps, I don't know, there are so many registers on which one can answer this question. So that's perhaps a more philosophical one, but a practical one, which I'll offer, is to read, there are so many great literary magazines, including Catapult, publishing fiction from new writers all the time. And so I would encourage somebody who wants to be in this field to read voraciously, see what your peers are writing, see what your peers are thinking about, and how you can respond.
There's another question here, which is also similar to one that I wanted to ask, but your dream impact on those who read a burning. To kind of put it another way, I had been thinking, like, if there was a certain reader reaction that you've been really hoping for, because I think authors are asked a lot, like, were you picturing a certain reader? And I personally don't love that question myself, but I think like your dream impact on those, you know, who read the book. Did you ever have like that in mind? And if so, what was it?
Wow. Well, I'm thinking about it now, and dream impact. I mean, I would hope that the book moves people, that it makes them laugh in places, that it reminds them what it looks like when people defy state oppression and try to live with joy. So I hope that, you know, they have this kind of emotional response to the book. That's always what you're trying with a story. And then after that emotional response has perhaps calmed, I hope that they find that there's a lot to think with in this book. I hope they find it an instrument with which they can interrogate injustice in their own community.
I'm moving on to, there's many questions. Forgive me, I can tell you in advance we won't get to all of them, but let's see. So here's another question. It might be kind of huge, but the person says, I wonder your thoughts on the direction you think India may be heading, you know, given the narrative that your novel offers.
I think that alongside the rise of the right, a really heartening thing has been the rise of vigorous resistance. We've seen this in India with, I know that there has been so much reporting about, you know, acts of violence and hatred in India, but at the same time, there have also been huge and often women-led resistance movements in India. You know, there was so much in the news about women who are coming to these protests for the first time, who did not see themselves as activists, who are now joining in. So I think that this wave of resistance will assert that India is a secular, pluralist country. It's a country for everybody who lives there. I hope that that is where it's going.
Another question, how did you develop your characters in a way that embodies social issues while giving them, oh, sorry, this just jumped, while giving them such wonderfully robust personalities?
I think the most interesting thing in any character is contradiction. You know, I didn't want them to be just avenues for expressing any view that I have. So to make them human, you have to make them act in ways that are sometimes selfish, sometimes generous, and sometimes they're able to find humor in things, and sometimes they sink into despair. And I think trying to build those contradictions in is one way of setting up your character. I'm guessing this is a fiction writer asking it. So, you know, that's one way of setting up your character, I think, to have the bones of a real person. I do think about this a lot because characters are kind of slightly dramatized versions of real people, right? Like, they are not real people, you make them up. So how to bring them as close to a person as possible is, I think, with contradiction.
I'm going to combine two questions now because they are both about writing and revision. One question is from Katie Boland about how you approach revision. Yes, and how you approach revision, either in terms of schedule or mindset while drafting. And then, if Katie will forgive me, I want to kind of combine it with this other writing question, which was what you do to get out of like a rut when you're writing, because they're somewhat, I think they can be somewhat related. They're both about sort of addressing like issues and struggles with the process.
Yeah. I revise a lot as I write. So for me, the process of writing and the process of revising, they don't look much different. I'm constantly rewriting previous pages and previous paragraphs.
It's because you're an editor. Sorry. we're really terrible. Okay.
But, you know, part of it is just, so there are two kind of contradictory answers to this, I think. And one is distance. I found it really valuable to put the book down for stretches of 3 weeks or a month at a time when I felt like I was getting to that point where I couldn't really see the pages anymore, and come back as a reader. Another kind of driving question that I had throughout revising this book was, how do I earn a reader's interest on every page? You know, I see this book as an act of invitation, and all of these kind of craft and revision questions are about, how do you invite a reader in, and how do you make sure this book, which is claiming their time, is rewarding their time, right? So those were very questions that were at my mind for me. And part of it is just, you know, sticking with it. This is maybe not a very inspiring answer, but I think we often look to other things, you know, like going to a coffee shop or, you know, taking a break and doing something else. But then so much of writing is just sticking with it and taking yourself to that place of discipline inside yourself where you know that you can write this, you can do this, you just have to stick with it.
Thank you. Another question from an audience member. Hi, Rachel. You're having such a huge and successful publication. What's the one thing that was most surprising / exciting / wild to you that happened for you or this book?
While I was writing the book, it is set entirely in India. I didn't really know if anybody in the US would be interested. So I think it's quite wild to me that anybody in this country is interested. You know, I don't take that interest for granted. So that has been really strange. But in many ways, the process has also been a really beautiful affirmation of something that I knew as an editor, which is that so many people work on a book. You know, it's one person's name on the cover, but this book would not have any kind of life without the work of my agent, my editor, my publishing professionals, just so many people who came to the book and took it on and championed it. And I think that is so good for any author to remember, is that, you know, a book comes out of devoted, hard teamwork.
There are so many questions. I'm really sorry. I'm kind of just skipping around at random. Please don't be offended if I skip yours. Here's one. From Laura Preston. Lovely is the heart of this novel, and I'd love to hear more about her voice. I also had a question for you about Lovely's voice. In particular, its cadence, rhythm, and grammar. And then she mentions the James Wood review in the New Yorker, which was a rave, of course, about how you are sounding the particular textures of Bengali through English. So can you talk more about this act of translation?
Yeah. Hi, Laura. My first language is Bengali. I grew up speaking Bengali, and I think Bengali is such a rich language. It holds so much room for tenderness and compassion and jokes. And even though I wrote this book in English, I knew that I wanted that tenderness to come through. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is, you know, English has such a loaded history in India. It's the language of the colonizer, and it is now seen as the language that you need to know in order to move up. It's the language you need to learn for, you know, future success. That's kind of how I struggled to learn English as a kid. And so I knew that this aspect of striving and struggle with English, realizing that English can settle into the nooks and crannies of your life, no matter how your life looks, and that you can bring to it the kind of aspiration that is yours, that form of English, that form of non-fluent, non-standard English felt really important to me to bring into this novel, and it felt true to Lovely's voice for me.
One more question, and then I guess I'd like to know if it's okay if we go a little bit over, or if I should really, if there's like a hard stop at 7:45, because I could read a few more questions. But we have another question here from Cynthia Sweeney about books and authors that are influential to this book and your work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm such a big fan of Jhumpa Lahiri's. I'm such a big fan of Arundhati Roy's, Daniel Moinuddin. He had this book of short stories several years ago called In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. And it was an absolutely brilliant book about Pakistan that I loved. So there are all of these books. I do think that I learned something from every book that I read. I learned something about openings and closings and structure and sentence. So in many ways, I feel like every in some way, or at least I find that perspective a joyful perspective with which to read.
I think that's a great place to stop.